Adolf Hitler had been waiting for this moment. For years, he believed the Western Allies would attempt a massive invasion of occupied Europe, and when they did, he was confident he could smash it. The plan was simple in theory: build an impenetrable defensive line along the French coast, crush the landing forces at the beaches, and throw them back into the sea before they could establish a foothold. Once that was done, Germany could shift its full power eastward and finish the war against the Soviet Union. But the plan depended on speed, coordination, and perfect timing. On June 6, 1944, that timing collapsed. The defensive system guarding Western Europe was known as the Atlantic Wall. Stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, it was a vast network of bunkers, artillery positions, minefields, and beach obstacles. Yet despite the propaganda, it was not a continuous wall. It was a patchwork of strongpoints, many still incomplete by the summer of 1944. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel took command of Army Group B, he immediately saw the weaknesses. Rommel had learned from North Africa that Allied air power made large-scale movement in daylight nearly impossible. He believed the invasion had to be defeated at the water's edge. If the Allies got ashore in strength, Germany would lose. Rommel pushed for mines, millions of them. He ordered wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, and underwater obstacles planted along the beaches to rip apart landing craft. He strengthened concrete bunkers and repositioned artillery to fire directly onto likely landing zones. But he faced opposition from his superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who believed armored reserves should be held inland for a massive counterattack once the main invasion site was identified. This disagreement over where to place Germany's precious Panzer divisions would prove fatal. At the heart of the problem was Hitler himself. Only he could authorize the release of key armored reserves, and Hitler was convinced the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. It seemed logical. The distance was shorter, the terrain offered direct routes into Germany. German intelligence, reinforced by an elaborate Allied deception campaign known as Operation Fortitude, fed this belief. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, and false radio traffic convinced German commanders that Normandy might only be a diversion. As a result, some of Germany's strongest formations were positioned far from the actual landing zones. Even as reports flooded in on the morning of June 6, describing massive airborne drops and amphibious assaults in Normandy, uncertainty paralyzed decision-making. Was this truly the main invasion, or a feint designed to pull German forces away from Pas-de-Calais? Rommel wasn't even in France when the landings began. He had returned to Germany to visit his wife for her birthday, believing poor weather made an invasion unlikely. Many senior commanders were absent for training exercises. The German High Command did not expect the Allies to attack in rough seas and heavy cloud cover. But that bad weather was precisely what the Allies used to achieve surprise. Before dawn, thousands of paratroopers dropped behind German lines. Bridges were seized, roads were blocked. Confusion spread rapidly. German communications faltered as telephone lines were cut, and units struggled to understand the scale of the attack. Reports were fragmented and contradictory. Some commanders hesitated, fearing to commit reserves too early. Others requested permission that would not come for hours. Meanwhile, along the beaches of Normandy, the largest amphibious invasion in history was unfolding. Yet even then, many German leaders remained convinced that the decisive blow would fall elsewhere. Hitler slept late that morning, and no one dared wake him to request immediate release of the armored reserves. By the time authorization came, crucial hours had been lost. The Atlantic Wall, formidable in appearance, was never designed to withstand such overwhelming air and naval bombardment. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Bridges, railways, and supply routes leading toward Normandy had been systematically destroyed in the weeks before the invasion. German reinforcements, attempting to move during daylight, were attacked relentlessly from above. Rommel's greatest fear was becoming reality. Once the Allies secured a foothold, pushing them back would be nearly impossible. The failure was not due to lack of courage among German soldiers. Many fought fiercely and effectively. The failure lay in strategic miscalculation. Germany prepared for the wrong landing site. It divided authority between commanders with conflicting visions. It relied on centralized decision-making at the very moment rapid response was essential, and it underestimated the scale and coordination of the Allied operation. Hitler had imagined a swift, crushing counterattack that would hurl the invaders into the Channel. Instead, hesitation, deception, and rigid command structures prevented Germany from reacting decisively. By the end of June 6th, the Allies had secured multiple beachheads. The opportunity to destroy the invasion at the shoreline had slipped away. What followed would be weeks of brutal fighting across the hedgerows of Normandy. But the crucial window, the narrow span of hours when Germany might have contained the invasion, had already closed. The plan to throw the Allies back into the sea had depended on speed and unity. On D-Day, Germany had neither. Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history moved toward the coast of Normandy. Nearly 7,000 ships crossed the English Channel. Around 156,000 Allied troops were committed to the landings. The plan looked overwhelming on paper. Massive naval bombardment, air superiority, specialized landing craft, and airborne drops behind enemy lines were all designed to ensure success. And yet, within hours, one beach would become synonymous with chaos and bloodshed. The Allies divided the coastline into 5 assault sectors. The Americans were assigned Utah and Omaha. The British took Gold and Sword. The Canadians landed at Juneau. Each beach had its own geography, defenses, and challenges. But the differences in casualty rates were dramatic. Nowhere was the fighting more intense than at Omaha Beach. Omaha was naturally suited for defense. High bluffs overlooked the shoreline, giving German defenders elevated firing positions. Concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery pieces were positioned to cover every approach. Interlocking fields of fire meant that if one position was suppressed, another could still sweep the beach. The defending units included experienced troops from the German 352nd Infantry Division, better trained and more prepared than Allied intelligence had expected. In the early morning darkness, Allied bombers attempted to neutralize these defenses, but poor visibility and fear of hitting their own troops caused many bombs to fall too far inland. Naval bombardment followed, but the duration was shorter than planned. When the landing craft approached, much of the German defensive network remained intact. As the first wave of American soldiers dropped their ramps, they faced devastating fire. Machine guns raked the water. Mortars exploded among tightly packed troops. Many soldiers drowned before even reaching the shore, weighed down with heavy equipment. Others were cut down in seconds. Landing craft were blown apart by mines and artillery. Units became scattered, officers were killed, and carefully rehearsed plans dissolved almost immediately. Meanwhile, just a few miles away at Utah Beach, the story was very different. Strong currents pushed American forces slightly off course, but this accident worked in their favor. They landed in a less heavily defended sector. German resistance was lighter, and airborne troops who had dropped inland disrupted enemy reinforcements. Casualties at Utah were significantly lower. A miscalculation of tides had unintentionally saved lives. The British and Canadian beaches presented yet another contrast. At Gold Beach and Sword Beach, British forces faced stiff opposition but benefited from specialized armored vehicles, Hobart's funnies, designed to clear mines, crush obstacles, and support infantry. These engineering tanks played a crucial role in breaching defenses. At Juneau Beach, Canadian troops initially suffered heavy casualties in the first assault wave, but they managed to push inland farther than any other Allied force on D-Day. Why was Omaha so different? Geography was one factor. The steep bluffs created a deadly killing zone. Intelligence failures were another. Allied planners underestimated the strength and readiness of German forces there. Weather conditions also disrupted amphibious tanks that were supposed to provide fire support. Many sank before reaching shore in rough seas. Without armored support, infantry were exposed. Yet the outcome at Omaha was not decided solely by German strength. It was also shaped by small unit leadership and improvisation. As organized assaults broke down, groups of soldiers gathered behind shingle banks and seawalls for cover. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers began forming ad hoc units. They identified weak points in the defenses and started climbing the bluffs, using grenades, rifle fire, and sheer determination. Naval destroyers moved dangerously close to shore to deliver direct fire against German bunkers. By midday, what had begun as near disaster slowly shifted. German positions were isolated and attacked from the flanks. Communication breakdowns prevented defenders from coordinating an effective counterattack. Despite horrific losses, over 2,000 American casualties at Omaha alone, the beachhead was secured by evening. The contrast between the beaches reveals a deeper truth on D-Day. Success was never guaranteed. Superior numbers and planning mattered, but terrain, weather, intelligence accuracy, and split-second decisions by individuals on the ground shaped the outcome. At some sectors, preparation and technology worked as intended. At others, like Omaha, survival depended on courage and improvisation under unimaginable pressure. By the end of June 6th, all 5 beaches were in Allied hands, but the price paid at Omaha became a symbol of the invasion's brutality. The landings proved that even the most carefully planned operation can unravel in moments, and that victory sometimes hinges not on grand strategy, but on scattered groups of soldiers refusing to stay pinned down on a narrow strip of sand. By the afternoon of June 6, 1944, the critical question was no longer whether the Allies had landed. It was whether Germany could still destroy the invasion before it became unstoppable. For Adolf Hitler, the strategy had always been clear: allow the enemy to come ashore, identify the main landing site, then unleash armored divisions in a massive counterattack that would split the beachhead and drive the invaders back into the sea. In theory, it was a devastating response. In reality, it never fully materialized. The core of Germany's defensive strength in France lay in its Panzer divisions. These were mobile, heavily armed formations capable of rapid concentration and shock action. But before D-Day, German commanders had argued fiercely over where these tanks should be positioned. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel insisted that armored units had to be placed close to the coast. He believed Allied air superiority would prevent long-distance movement once the invasion began. If the panzers were held too far inland, they would be destroyed on the roads before ever reaching the beaches. His superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, disagreed. Rundstedt favored keeping the armored reserves centralized, ready to strike once the true invasion point was identified. Hitler compromised badly. Some panzer divisions were placed near the coast under Rommel's control, while others were kept farther inland under direct authorization from Hitler himself. This split command structure guaranteed delay. When the first reports of airborne landings in Normandy came in shortly after midnight, confusion dominated the German response. Thousands of Allied paratroopers had dropped behind the beaches, seizing bridges and blocking key roads. German officers struggled to determine whether this was the main invasion or a diversion. The deception campaign, known as Fortitude, had convinced much of the German high command that the real assault would come at Pas-de-Calais. Normandy, in their minds, might simply be a feint.
As dawn broke and the scale of the amphibious landings became undeniable, requests to release the armored reserves were sent up the chain of command. But Hitler was asleep. His inner circle hesitated to wake him. Hours passed. Those hours were critical. In amphibious warfare, timing is everything. A counterattack launched while troops are still disorganized on the beaches can be decisive. A counterattack launched after they have secured artillery, supplies, and reinforcements is far more difficult. The only armored unit positioned close enough to respond immediately was the 21st Panzer Division. By late afternoon, elements of this division advanced toward the British and Canadian sectors between Sword and Juno beaches. For a brief moment, German tanks reached the coastline, threatening to split the Allied forces. It was one of the few instances on D-Day where the situation hung in genuine balance. But Allied air power intervened. Fighter bombers patrolled the skies relentlessly. German armored columns moving in daylight were attacked with rockets and bombs. Even when tanks survived, their progress slowed. Bridges had been destroyed, roads were cratered, communications were unreliable. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor broke down under pressure. Meanwhile, the larger panzer divisions held inland, among them elite formations like the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr, did not move in full strength on June 6th. By the time they began major operations in the following days, the Allies had already reinforced their beachheads with thousands of additional troops and vehicles. What might have been a sharp, concentrated blow became a series of fragmented engagements. German counterattacks throughout June were fierce but lacked unity. At places like Villers-Bocage and Caen, armored clashes were brutal and costly. German tanks such as the Panther and Tiger often outgunned their Allied counterparts. Tactically, German crews demonstrated skill and experience. Strategically, however, they were fighting a losing battle. The Allies possessed overwhelming industrial capacity, steady reinforcements, and total air dominance. Rommel's earlier warning proved accurate. Once the Allies established a firm foothold, pushing them back became nearly impossible. Every German movement during daylight invited air attack. Supply shortages worsened. Fuel became scarce. Replacement vehicles and trained crews were limited. The Wehrmacht could still strike hard, but it could not sustain large-scale offensive operations against an enemy growing stronger by the hour. Perhaps most damaging was the continued belief in Berlin that Normandy might not be the main invasion. Even weeks after D-Day, significant German forces remained positioned near Pas-de-Calais, waiting for a second landing that would never come. Hitler's refusal to fully commit all available reserves to Normandy diluted Germany's response at the decisive point. In hindsight, the failure of the German counterattacks was not due to lack of bravery or even lack of equipment. It was the result of hesitation, divided command, Allied deception, and overwhelming air superiority. The window of opportunity existed, but it was narrow. When it closed on June 6th, it did so permanently. By the time German armored divisions were fully engaged in Normandy, they were no longer attacking a vulnerable landing force. They were confronting a rapidly expanding Allied army, supplied across the Channel and protected by the most powerful air force in the world. The plan to throw the Allies back into the sea had depended on speed and concentration. Instead, Germany delivered delay and fragmentation, and in modern mechanized warfare, delay can be fatal.
On D-Day, technology and firepower were not just supporting elements of the battle. They shaped the experience of every soldier who stepped onto the beaches of Normandy. Weapons determined who could move, who had to take cover, and who survived the first critical minutes of contact. To understand why the fighting unfolded the way it did, you have to look closely at the tools both sides carried into battle. For the average American infantryman, the standard rifle was the M1 Garand. It was a semi-automatic weapon,
capable of firing 8 rounds rapidly without manual cycling between shots. In close combat, that rate of fire offered a major advantage over the German Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifle. While the German rifle was accurate and reliable, it required the shooter to manually operate the bolts after each shot. In fast-moving engagements, especially when assaulting fortified positions, the ability to fire multiple rounds quickly could mean the difference between suppressing a machine gun nest or being pinned down by it. But rifles alone did not dominate the beaches. The true terror weapon of German defenses was the MG-42 machine gun. With a firing rate of up to 1,200 rounds per minute, it produced a sound often described by Allied troops as ripping canvas or tearing cloth. Its high velocity and rapid fire created dense killing zones, especially on beaches like Omaha Beach, where elevated bunkers gave German gunners clear fields of fire. The MG-42 was not just lethal, it was psychologically devastating. Units caught in its path often found movement nearly impossible without coordinated suppression. Artillery also played a critical role. German coastal batteries were positioned to fire directly onto landing areas, pre-sighted to strike likely approach routes. Mortars added another layer of danger, dropping shells onto tightly packed soldiers struggling in shallow water or trapped behind obstacles. Yet, despite this firepower, many of these defensive systems depended on fixed positions. Once Allied troops managed to flank or isolate a bunker, its effectiveness dropped sharply. On the Allied side, naval gunfire was a crucial counterweight. Battleships and cruisers offshore delivered massive shells against German fortifications. While early bombardment did not destroy all defenses, later in the day, destroyers moved dangerously close to shore to provide direct fire support. Their guns targeted machine gun nests and artillery positions that had survived the initial barrage. This naval intervention was instrumental in easing pressure on infantry units that were otherwise pinned down. Armor was another decisive factor, though its performance varied dramatically by sector. The American M4 Sherman tank was mechanically reliable and relatively easy to produce in large numbers. However, it was generally outgunned and more lightly armored than German Panthers and Tigers encountered later in Normandy. On D-Day itself, many Sherman tanks were modified as amphibious DD tanks, equipped with flotation screens that allowed them to launch from offshore. In rough seas, especially off Omaha, many of these tanks sank before reaching land. Without their intended armored support, infantry units faced fortified positions alone. In contrast, British forces deployed specialized armored vehicles designed specifically for amphibious assault. Such innovations included mine-clearing tanks, bridge-laying vehicles, and flame-throwing variants. Such engineering solutions often succeeded where brute force alone would have failed. German armored forces, when they did engage, fielded formidable machines. The Panther tank, with its powerful 75mm high-velocity gun, could destroy Allied armor at long range. The Tiger I, even more heavily armored and armored, inspired fear among Allied crews. However, these tanks were mechanically complex and required significant maintenance. Fuel shortages, limited numbers, and constant Allied air attacks reduced their operational impact. A superior tank is only effective if it can reach the battlefield in time. Air power acted as a weapon system in its own right. Allied fighter-bombers roamed the skies, striking convoys, artillery positions, and reinforcements. German forces moving in daylight risked immediate attack. This constant aerial threat limited Germany's ability to coordinate large-scale counterattacks. In many cases, the mere presence of Allied aircraft forced German units to delay movement or disperse, weakening their concentration of force. Ultimately, weapons alone did not determine victory. Training, coordination, logistics, and morale mattered just as much. The M1 Garand's firepower gave American infantry flexibility. The MG-42's devastating rate of fire made German defensive positions deadly. Sherman tanks provided mobility and support, even if technically inferior to some German counterparts. Specialized engineering vehicles turned impossible obstacles into manageable problems. Each system reflected broader industrial and strategic strengths. D-Day was not won by a single weapon or lost because of a single technological failure. It was shaped by the interaction of many systems: machine guns locking down beaches, naval guns silencing bunkers, tanks struggling through surf, and aircraft dominating the skies. The battlefield in Normandy became a test of whose technology could adapt faster, move sooner, and integrate more effectively under fire. And in that combined effort of firepower, coordination, and industrial scale, the balance ultimately tilted in the Allies' favor.
By the end of June 6, 1944, the Allies had achieved what many thought might be impossible. They had landed in force on the coast of Nazi-occupied France and held their ground. But D-Day was never meant to win the war in a single day. Securing the beaches was only the beginning. The real test came in the weeks that followed, in a brutal and grinding battle across the fields and hedgerows of Normandy. Many Allied planners had hoped for a rapid advance inland. Once ashore, mechanized forces were supposed to break out quickly, capture key cities, and drive toward Paris. Instead, progress slowed almost immediately. The landscape itself became an enemy. Much of Normandy's countryside was divided into small fields bordered by thick hedgerows, dense earthen embankments covered in vegetation, sometimes several feet high. These natural barriers limited visibility, blocked tank movement, and created perfect defensive positions. German forces, though shocked by the scale of the invasion, regrouped quickly. Elite formations such as the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr were committed to the fight. Around the city of Caen, German troops dug in deeply, turning villages and crossroads into strongpoints. The British and Canadian forces advancing toward Caen encountered fierce resistance. What had been expected to fall on D-Day remained contested for weeks. In the American sector, the struggle was just as intense. Every hedgerow could conceal machine guns, anti-tank weapons, or concealed infantry. Tanks advancing without infantry support risked ambush at close range. Infantry advancing without armor were exposed to mortar and artillery fire. Progress was measured not in miles, but in yards. Casualties mounted steadily on both sides. The Germans, despite being outnumbered and increasingly cut off from reliable supply lines, fought with determination. Defensive doctrine emphasized counterattacks to regain lost ground. Local commanders launched repeated armored thrusts, trying to contain the Allied advance before it could gain momentum. In several engagements, German Panther and Tiger tanks demonstrated superior firepower, knocking out Shermans at long range. Tactically, German units often performed effectively. Strategically, however, they faced overwhelming disadvantages. Allied air superiority continued to dominate the battlefield. Fighter bombers patrolled constantly, attacking German reinforcements and supply convoys. Rail lines and bridges had already been heavily damaged before D-Day, making it difficult for Germany to shift reserves into Normandy. Fuel shortages became increasingly severe. Even when German tanks were operational, moving them under daylight conditions invited air attack. Logistics became the Allies' greatest strength. Every day, more troops, vehicles, artillery pieces, and supplies poured across the English Channel. Temporary artificial harbors known as mulberries
allowed massive quantities of equipment to be unloaded despite damaged port facilities. What Germany could not replace, the Allies could. The balance of power shifted steadily as Allied numbers grew. Still, the breakout did not come easily. Allied commanders debated how to break the stalemate. Some favored concentrated armored thrusts. Others argued for broader pressure along the entire front. Ultimately, the breakthrough came in late July with Operation Cobra. Following a massive aerial bombardment, American forces punched through weakened German lines near Saint-Lô. Once the front cracked, mobility returned to the battlefield. German units, already stretched thin, began to collapse under sustained pressure. As Allied forces advanced rapidly south and west, the risk of encirclement grew. The fighting culminated in the Falaise pocket, where large numbers of German troops were trapped. Though many escaped, thousands were killed or captured, and vast amounts of equipment were destroyed. The German army in Normandy was effectively shattered. The slow breakout after D-Day reveals a critical truth. Amphibious invasion was only the first step in a much larger campaign. The Allies had to adapt to terrain they had underestimated. They had to coordinate multinational forces under constant pressure, and they had to endure weeks of attritional combat before maneuver warfare could resume. For Germany, Normandy marked the beginning of irreversible decline in the West. The failure to crush the invasion at the beaches meant fighting a prolonged battle against an enemy with superior resources, industry, and air power. Once the breakout occurred, there was no realistic opportunity to restore the situation. D-Day did not end the war in Europe, but it ensured that the war would now be fought on German-occupied soil from the west as well as the east. The long struggle through Normandy, through hedgerows, ruined towns, and shattered armored divisions, transformed a precarious beachhead into a decisive turning point. What began as a desperate fight for survival on narrow strips of sand became the opening act of the liberation of Western Europe.